The document landed on my desk like a warning shot. Verona didn't sit. She stood over me, one hand still pressing the paper flat, like she needed it to leave a mark not just on the wood grain, but on me. "Sign this," she said, her voice clipped and chilled, "or I'll blacklist you in 36 countries. I glanced at the pages. Revised non-compete. 3 years. Dozens of jurisdictions. Clauses so wide they bordered on fiction. The kind of language that wasn't designed to protect a company, but to bury a person. I reached for the pen. Not in panic, not in fear, but in precision. She narrowed her eyes. Maybe she expected protest. Maybe she wanted it. I signed my name clean, centered, and final. Her lips curled, slightly victorious. "Good," she murmured. "I'll have legal process." "That won't be necessary," I said, rising. "I've submitted my resignation, effective immediately." Verona blinked. It was brief, that flicker of confusion before her face reset. The smirk returned. "You won't get far, Margot. I told you everywhere you try to go, I'll already be there." I nodded. "I know." She watched me gather my coat. I left the folder she gave me untouched on the desk. What she didn't notice, what no one in the office did, was the second document I slid across the table when I signed. It wasn't her non-compete. It was a trigger letter to my attorney. Sealed, time-stamped, notarized. By the time Verona realized what it was, she would already be explaining a collapsed joint venture to the board. Outside, the air felt different. Not free exactly, more like loaded, like silence before a storm. I didn't walk fast. I didn't look back. The building didn't deserve a glance. My phone buzzed. Not Verona, not legal. Just a one-word message from someone 3 time zones away. "Ready," I replied with 3 words. Already in motion. And as I crossed Lexington, I thought about the last 5 years, airports, languages, contracts, inked at midnight. No, I didn't sign the paper she gave me. I signed the beginning of something else. Before Verona ever learned the company's name, I was already landing deals in São Paulo with a translator who barely kept up. I didn't wait for permission. I booked the flights, made the calls, and built the foundation of what they would later call global solutions. But back then, it was just me, 2 suitcases, and a laptop with a cracked hinge. The first partnership came from a cold email I sent at 2:14 a.m. They didn't respond for 10 days. When they did, I was already en route to Singapore alone. My life became a blur of gate numbers, unread messages from my sister, and crash course phone calls in business Mandarin. I slept in airports because time zones didn't wait. I memorized regulatory frameworks in 3 continents because no one else on the team could pronounce the agency names, let alone work with them. The deals weren't flashy, not at first, but they were real. Built on trust, long dinners, and knowing when to hold eye contact and when to nod in silence. I didn't ask for recognition. I assumed it would come. That if I made the work undeniable, the credit would follow. Then came Verona. She was hired during a leadership reshuffle brought in from a competing firm with a sleek portfolio and a reputation for scaling fast. She requested an overview of the division I had built. I gave her everything: notes, contacts, cultural briefs, forecasts. At first, she listened, asked smart questions, showed interest, but then in a quarterly meeting, she presented my 5-year expansion roadmap as her own, word for word, same phrasing, same diagrams I had spent months refining. The partners I introduced her to, she claimed them as legacy contacts. I stayed quiet. I told myself she was new. Maybe it was unintentional. Maybe it was temporary, but the company press release listing her as the architect of global solutions was not temporary. Still, I kept building, working, showing up at 3 a.m. in another city, speaking fluent Arabic over coffee that tasted like ash. Because I believed deep down that if I just made it excellent enough, someone would notice. They didn't. Not then. And by the time they did, it was because something had started to fall apart. The boardroom was colder than usual, the kind of chill that didn't come from air conditioning. Verona stood at the head of the table, clicker in hand, smile rehearsed. Her tone was just casual enough to seem confident, just polished enough to seem brilliant. Slide 1 opened with a phrase I'd written during a layover in Oslo. By slide 4, she was quoting performance metrics I had compiled during Ramadan, adjusting calls to local hours so our partners in Casablanca felt respected. Her timeline mirrored mine exactly. I knew it down to the font spacing because I had spent weeks agonizing over every visual. And when she reached the core strategy, the tiered trust entry model for culturally diverse markets, she called it her framework. No one asked questions. No one glanced toward the back row where I sat with my notebook closed. One board member leaned forward. "This kind of insight," he said, "is what sets us apart. Strategic clarity." Another nodded. Finally, someone thinking long-term about localization. I didn't move. I didn't speak. My hands rested in my lap. I'd presented to most of these people before on smaller wins, in smaller rooms. They'd heard my voice. But not today. Today, they were hearing Verona's. When the meeting adjourned, Verona shook hands like a keynote speaker. One of the board members clapped her on the shoulder and said, "Next stop, Vice President." She laughed. "Let's see where we land." I walked out before anyone could stop me or worse, pretend to remember I was there. That night in my apartment, I pulled up my presentation archives and laid them side by side with the deck she'd used, identical down to the diagram colors. I didn't cry, I didn't rage. I documented email trails, meeting invites, calendar logs, call summaries. Every proof of authorship I had, I stored under one folder. Name ICE. It stood for in case of erasure. And 3 weeks later, I added another file, this one labeled offer, from a firm that actually wanted to hear what I had to say. The offer came from Kellenridge and Maris, a firm with reach in emerging markets and a reputation for treating talent like partners, not pawns. They had done their homework. They knew the structure I built, the numbers I delivered, and most importantly, the difference between the name on the slide and the voice behind the deals. Their proposal was generous. Executive director, full autonomy, a charter to build a new Asia-Pacific strategy from scratch. It was everything I'd earned and never been given. I didn't go to Verona out of protocol. I went to gauge her threshold for recognition. I laid the offer out clearly. I explained the scope, the value they saw in me, the timeline. What I didn't say but hoped she'd feel was the window she had to finally acknowledge my worth. She didn't even look up. "Evelyn," she said, using my first name the way some people use slaps, "you're overestimating your role here. You've been involved in the execution, certainly, but the vision, the relationships, that's all come from my level." My chest went still. She wasn't denying the facts, just repackaging them as if I were a glorified assistant who just happened to travel a lot. "If another firm wants to hire you for basic operational support," she added, "that's their prerogative." I said I needed time to consider. The next morning, she called me into her office. No small talk, no smile. "This is your updated non-compete," she said, placing a fresh document on the table. 3 years, 36 countries, no client contact, no affiliation, no advisory. I skimmed it once. The restrictions were absurd, broad enough to choke any path forward, brutal enough to make sure I stayed right where she wanted me, silent, dependent, boxed in. "This isn't enforceable," I said evenly. "Maybe not in court," she replied. "But I don't need a courtroom to shut doors. I know every major player. You'll be amazed how many places just stop calling." I nodded once and took the paper. Not in agreement, in understanding. That night, I made 3 calls my attorney, my mentor in Zurich, and a man I once helped pull a deal back from collapse in Seoul. Only one of them asked what was going on. I said, "It's time to build something Verona can't blacklist." I disappeared. Not in the dramatic sense, there were no announcements, no public farewell, but quietly, like a light, turned off in a room no one was watching. I stopped replying to industry invitations, stopped posting, stopped being available. And almost immediately, the whispers started. People assumed I'd been blacklisted. Others thought I'd burned out or made a poor career move and was now licking wounds somewhere in upstate obscurity. A few sent polite messages laced with curiosity disguised as concern. I responded to none of them. Because while Verona was polishing her conference speeches and trying to plug the holes I'd left behind, I was in a co-working basement in Foggy Bottom, drafting the blueprint for something she couldn't touch, Ethra Strategies. Not a consultancy, not exactly. Not a competitor in name, but a redefinition of the category entirely. We wouldn't manage. We'd guide. We wouldn't chase clients. We'd solve problems no one else had the lens to see. In between strategy sessions and corporate filings, I returned to something I hadn't touched in years, Verona's deals. The contracts she forced me to hand over, the ones I had built from the ground up and she rebranded with her own signature. I read them line by line, and then I read them again. It was buried deep in a procurement sub-agreement tied to a mid-level distributor in Jakarta. A clause she'd never understood, probably thought it was standard language. But it wasn't. It was jurisdictional. And it didn't just invalidate a piece of the contract. It invalidated the entire framework of exclusivity for a multilateral partnership worth hundreds of millions. I took screenshots, created summaries, called in a specialist to verify my interpretation. I didn't rush. Timing mattered. Precision mattered more. On day 86, I drafted a letter but didn't send it. Not yet. On day 89, I finalized Ethra's launch date and filed a short quiet notice with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. And on day 90, I made a single update to the ICE folder on my desktop. File added clause 27J disclosure trigger.pdf. Then I turned off my notifications and waited. The alert came through as I was pouring tea. No headline, just a quiet update tucked into a financial ticker. Silventra backs out of projected $600 joint venture with Calderon Group citing internal compliance concerns. No press release. No public drama. Just a single surgical retraction. I knew exactly which clause had triggered it. Clause 27J. The one Verona had skimmed. The one buried in an appendix she'd dismissed as peripheral. The one that, when interpreted correctly, exposed the joint venture to cross-jurisdictional conflict. A week ago, I had sent a short confidential memo to Silventra's legal team, unsigned, unattributed, but precise. It referenced risk exposure tied to the exclusivity framework with enough technical detail to hold weight and just enough redaction to raise eyebrows. They did the rest. Quietly, legally. Verona didn't see it coming. By noon, her assistant had called an emergency session. By Tuesday, the board was assembling. I didn't need access to know what was happening. When a $600 million deal collapses, mid-negotiation silence becomes expensive. She blamed unexpected regulatory tensions, market volatility, shifting compliance thresholds. What she didn't blame, what she couldn't, was the paper she herself had signed, crafted from notes she didn't understand, stitched together from trust she'd never earned. I didn't gloat. I didn't text anyone. But my legal advisor, Mara, called and said only one thing. Well, that domino fell exactly as expected. I nodded, though she couldn't see me. Next one's lined up. Mara laughed. You tell me. Across the street, a courier arrived with the first shipment of Ethra's branded materials. Letterhead, business cards, welcome kits for 3 new hires starting next Monday. The timing wasn't coincidental. Inside my bag was a list, shorthand-written deliberate. Partners who'd ask to be notified when you're doing something of your own. I folded the list in half and slid it beside the tea. Verona had made a fatal mistake. She thought power came from proximity. She forgot that some knives don't need to be visible to cut, and I had just made the first incision. The Global Strategy Forum was always Verona's arena. Lights dimmed just right, name tags polished the kind of crowd that valued language more than truth. She stood center stage like a veteran conductor speaking of legacy partnerships, breakthrough expansions, and her framework for cultural fluidity in foreign markets. I wasn't there. I didn't need to be. The first 10 minutes followed the script's sleek slides, applause lines rehearsed to the syllable. But then she brought up the Asia-Pacific expansion, describing it as a personal triumph, a result of years of relationship building and regional presence. That's when I heard about it later from 3 different sources. The interruption came from the front row. Darius Nyambe, CEO of Indatra Holdings, leaned forward, one brow raised. You weren't part of that deal. The room paused. Verona blinked. Recovered too fast. With respect, I worked closely with your team. No, he said louder. You were copied on one memo. The woman who flew in 3 times during regulatory lockdowns. She wasn't you. A few heads turned. Then another voice. A partner from Telmex Global asked why communication broke down after the woman who actually listened stopped answering emails. Then another someone from Yushima Industrial questioned her data on trade zones, data I knew hadn't been updated since I left. Verona's smile thinned. She adjusted the mic shuffled papers. She tried to pivot, cited sources deflected. It didn't work. What followed wasn't a Q&A. It was a quiet unraveling. One by one, the audience began to recognize what they weren't supposed to question, that the face at the podium didn't match the work behind the curtain. No one stood to clap when she finished. No one rushed the stage. Later that afternoon, Ethra's general inbox received 6 new inquiries: strategic consulting, emerging market alignment, requests for a conversation with Ms. Ellerin. By evening, I had a voicemail from someone on Verona's board. We need to talk, he said. Soon. I replayed it once more, and filed it under a new folder. Name return calls. Because sometimes, when they write you out of the story, all you have to do is let the story correct itself. The invitation came through a secure channel, no assistants copied, no meeting room pre-booked. Ceylon Draper wanted to speak off record, which in corporate language means something had cracked beneath the surface. We met at a neutral cafe tucked between embassy offices. No fanfare, just 2 people with too much context and not enough time. We miscalculated, he said, skipping preamble. We thought Verona's Polish equaled substance. I said nothing. She sold the illusion well. But the gaps are wide now. Clients are uneasy. We're bleeding partnerships we didn't know were fragile. He paused before continuing. We need someone who understands what made it work the first time. I'm not coming back as staff, I said evenly. He nodded. We figured. Ethra stays autonomous, I added. No rebranding, no internal oversight. I report to the board, period. He exhaled like a man who'd been expecting a worse demand. 2 weeks, he said. Let's work out the terms. The negotiations weren't short, but they were precise. I refused quarterly micromanagement, refused to absorb Verona's leftover team, and refused to work under the department she once controlled. When the final agreement was signed, it came with 3 lines that mattered most. That same week, Verona was moved to the Denver office regional operations, strictly domestic. The announcement cited organizational restructuring. There was no memo about me, no press release, no welcome email. But within 48 hours, 3 dormant partnerships reactivated. The silence said more than a headline ever could. Back in my office, I erased the ICE folder from my drive. I no longer needed insurance. I had ownership. One of the new associates, Alethea, dropped off a folder with client onboarding notes. On top was a sticky note. They asked for you, by name. I filed it under acknowledged, and then I opened my laptop to draft the plan Verona never saw because it was never built for her approval. 3 days after the board signed the partnership, it showed up in my inbox, forwarded from a contact still buried somewhere in Verona's thinning web. The subject line read, "Concerns about external engagement." The body was exactly what I expected. Cold, veiled, clinging to relevance. Given the sensitivity of our international frameworks, is it advisable to grant operational influence to an external party with extensive insider knowledge? I recommend a review of this decision before further exposure. VL. The next day, the reply came from Ceylon Draper, copied to the full executive team. Thank you, Verona. To clarify, international operations are no longer within your purview. Strategic oversight will be handled exclusively by Ethra Strategies in alignment with board directives. CD, no emotion, just institutional clarity. I stared at the screen for a moment, then hit print. The paper was warm when I took it from the tray. I didn't frame it. I didn't highlight anything. I slid it into a folder marked Resolve and locked it in the cabinet behind my desk. It wasn't a trophy. It was a reminder. That silence isn't weakness. That erasure isn't permanent. That truth, when armed with documentation and timing, cuts deeper than public scenes ever could. Later that week, I ran into one of Verona's former analysts in the elevator of our shared building. She looked down at the Ethra badge clipped to my jacket. "You're Margot Ellerin," I nodded. She hesitated. "We always knew it was you. The strategy, the fixes, she just made it hard to say out loud." I smiled. "Now you can." When I got back to my office, a courier was waiting with a package from our newest client, a group Verona once called non-scalable. Inside was a handwritten note, "Glad to be building with the original architect." I placed it next to the onboarding stack and opened the next file. It was time to return to the blueprint and add the wings Verona never thought to imagine. Every morning I walked through Ethra's glass doors, no badge scans, no line of sight approvals, just clean open air and people who know why they're here. My office isn't large, but everything in it has weight. The books on the shelf are the ones I marked during overnight flights. The wall clock doesn't tick, it glides. And in the second drawer of the locked cabinet beneath my desk, there's a single envelope sealed, notarized, time-stamped. It's the paper I signed the day Verona tried to trap me in 36 countries. Not the non-compete, the trigger letter, 3 lines addressed to my attorney activating a pre-approved clause tied to a procurement agreement drafted back in 2019. Verona never read that agreement. She thought it was administrative, a formality buried in local vendor compliance. But buried in that memo was a jurisdictional inconsistency, a clause that rendered her newly drafted non-compete structurally unenforceable in half of the markets she claimed to control. The same clause she used as leverage had been undermined before her threat ever left her mouth. I didn't use it to sue her. I didn't wave it in front of the board. I let it work quietly, dismantling her credibility deal by deal, as partners discovered that the empire she built was held together by assumptions, not strategy. Ethra doesn't operate like she did. We don't chase scale. We don't bluff capability. We solve what's real and leave the theatrics to those still obsessed with titles. Verona's name hasn't come up in months. Last I heard, she was managing operational workflows in Denver. Internally reassigned, publicly ignored. She tried to blacklist me, tried to make sure no door opened without her permission. But I didn't just sidestep the blacklist. I rewrote the map. Now, when a client enters a new market, they don't ask who owns the network. They ask who understands it. And every time someone prints a contract that works because of the framework I designed, I don't think about revenge. I think about precision. I think about how quiet power isn't given, it's built and stored. Sometimes in a locked drawer, sometimes in a name they'll never overwrite again.